Well, thank you very much, everyone, for the introductions there. My name is Rory Canavan, and along with Kylie, we're going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about ITAM and automation and the features, benefits, and advantages of same. How did we arrive at this topic as something that we could put a few slides together on? That was basically through the completion of the piece of work that you see there that we recently completed. It was a refresh of a former piece of work. But what we did this time round to actually create processes in and around HAM and SAM was to sit down and crawl over ISO 19770 and say what process would we need to actually address these concerns and considerations that the standard throws up. Rightly proud of the piece of work, not least because we're only one of two organisations that have since then gone on to authenticate that work against ISO 19770-8, which is a methodology by which you put your body of work through to say that the work aligns to -1. All a bit confusing, but as I said, we're only one of two organisations in the world that have done it. So rightly proud. If you are thinking about ITAM or some considerations, you've got a reference source there. So without further ado, let's push on to the meat and potatoes of what we're actually going to be presenting about today.
Just a moment, Rory. The other thing actually is if you're interested in, as ITAM Accelerate, we actually publish a load of blogs and newsletters and things that are sort of oriented more at advanced practitioners, so that we hope are really thought-provoking and inspire you in your practice to sort of try new things and think about things in a slightly different way. So if you'd like to sign up to those newsletters or to sort of follow our stuff on LinkedIn, then please do follow us on LinkedIn, and we'll put the sign up link in the presentation for you to access afterwards as well. So anyway, right, go on, Rory.
So you're driving the slides.
Yep, there we go. Oh, that was not what I meant to do. I didn't mean to press on the link.
Okay, there we go. It is live, folks. Again, just to give you a run through on what the next 40 or so minutes is going to shape up to be, I just want to sort of take you through some of the primary headings that we're going to be talking about. A lot of organizations, when they start thinking about automation, is getting systems to talk to each other. And so we'll be talking there on the first bullet about tool integration. What does your high level design or your technical design actually look like? Another point that we often forget when we think about doing SAM or ITAM is that we've got this goal of turning our ELP function into some sort of Fabergé egg production machine. We're not all about that. We should actually be looking at the entities that bounce around in our SAM solution, so that once we know what a request or a purchase actually looks like, respecting the life cycle for those given entities. RPA has recently sort of reared its head and is very en vogue at the moment. So if you want to do more than just build those highways of APIs between systems, and you want some intelligence around data management and data manipulation, then perhaps robotic process automation is the way forward. We're also going to be talking about tagging as well, and how, if you're going to think about even approaching putting SAM best practice or ITAM best practice into the cloud, why tagging is absolutely vital and how that can link back into automation and reporting. Regardless of whether you take a tagging approach or not, you are going to need KPIs and performance monitoring. This assumption that because everything is automated and kicked over as sort of an IT fence and that everything just hums along is a recipe for disaster. So keeping an eye on the automation that you put in place is absolutely vital. And Kylie's going to round out the presentation with presentations around choice architecture and also value streams and use cases. So don't just automatically assume that because you've built a software request process that it operates in isolation. It interacts and it mingles with other processes then at that point. So let's get stuck in.
Great, thanks, Rory. So as Rory said, when most people think about automation, we think about connecting tools together. And these days, it's actually really easy to do so with APIs, application programming interfaces. So one of the most common interfaces or integrations that we need to make in our software asset management is that between our software asset management suite and our service management suite, and specifically the configuration management database. So I'm just going to talk through a couple of different models that I've seen out in the wild for how these two tools are automated, and just have a quick think about some of the pros and the cons, so that you can sort of have a think about how your own organization is structured and whether there might be a different way of doing it that might help you drive improvements and drive additional value from the way you integrate these two tools. So the first scenario I see, which is quite common in smaller organizations, is one where actually we have a completely separate IT service management tool where data is being pulled from a configuration management database module of the service management tool, and from there incidents and changes and problems and service transition and all those sorts of things, they're all managed from the CMDB within the service management tool. And then we've got a completely separate tool which is going out and discovering a load of data, and actually what it's then the software asset management team are then using the data that's in the tool that it's discovered itself in order to perform license management actions. So actually there's no integration between the two tools whatsoever. One of the advantages of this approach is, although it is a very manual thing to be doing, is that it gives you two entirely separate data sources. So you can actually compare the data between the two and identify and remediate any discrepancies. So if you've got people actively doing that, then this model can help you understand and identify data issues and help you maintain data accuracy in both tools. But it is a manual process and requires a fair amount of effort to do so. The cons for this approach can be really quite significant, and it all stems from the fact that you've got lots and lots and lots of people using the service management tool, and therefore they've got a vested interest in maintaining the configuration management database. But you only have a small team, so maybe 3 or 4 people at the most, using the data in the SAM tool. And so that small team can find that it becomes very difficult if there are issues with the SAM tool or issues with agents to effectively motivate people to help them resolve those issues. So you can end up with a very isolated tool that gradually the quality of data within that tool gets worse and worse. The SAM team start tearing their hair out because it's really challenging for them to get improvements implemented or to get issues with the tool remediated. So when I've seen software asset management really struggle, sometimes the root cause can be because the SAM tool is unloved and because we're not leveraging and because people are focused on the service management tool at the expense of the license management tool. The next model of integration I see is one that's probably more common in organizations with relatively mature IT asset management or software asset management. And they've had a team in there for quite a long while who've been doing fantastic work, pulling in the data from the SAM tool into the SAM tool and analyzing it, and then actually being really proactive and going out to the organization and to service management, particularly saying, look at all of our fantastic data. And so what happens is that you then might put in an integration which pulls in your accurate data from the SAM tool, puts it in the CMDB so that the service management functions can take advantage of it. So the pros of this is you do have one source of accurate data, and you do have people with a very strong vested interest in making sure that that data is accurate. And because everybody is relying on it, everybody is incentivized to give that tool the love it needs to continue doing a fantastic job. The downside of this is twofold. Firstly, what happens is that IT asset management then gradually becomes accountable for the data in the ITSM tool, and they start getting potentially having additional work put on them because everyone's relying on them to make sure that the data is accurate, and it maybe pulls them away a little bit from what their day job would look like. or from what the day job is. The other con is that often, well, in fact, SAM tools themselves actually don't discover all the data that IT service management needs. So SAM tools will discover what's installed on machines. They might capture sort of where there's SaaS products in use, for instance, if they're poll routers and things like that. But they often don't provide the information that service management needs around network equipment, what telecoms cables and things are running where, and just not telecoms cables, but sort of lines and stuff like that. So you still find that some parts of the service management organization are maintaining their own data, and actually that means that because they're maintaining, the network team maintains their own spreadsheet, that networking information is not available to other service management functions in the way that you actually would want it to be. So the final configuration of tools that I see quite often, particularly for mature organizations and organizations that have implemented a really sophisticated service management tool, ServiceNow springs to mind, Cherwell, BMC, is what they'll do is they'll pull the discovered data into the configuration management database and actually then rely on the data in there to provide the data required to perform license management. I mean, and this model is implicit within ServiceNow if you have SAM Pro, for instance. So this can be a really great model because it means that you're able to use that data all through your software lifecycle processes and leverage that data all through the lifecycle processes. And so you can implement quite sophisticated workflows and automations that push software through its lifecycle in a way which really drives value for the organization and the people who need to use the software. So the pros of this model is that everybody is relying on the same data. Service management has all the data it needs. And as I said, you can really build out some very sophisticated workflows that move between software asset management and service management. There are some cons though, because most configuration management databases don't, and discovery tools that are aligned to them or that are used with them, don't necessarily bring back all of the data that the IT asset management team needs in order to manage licenses. And so they may find that they have to supplement the data in the CMDB with some more specialist data. And then the other thing, which is a real problem, is that all too often, I've said this again and again and again, organizations that implement a really sophisticated IT service management tool think that the tool will do all the work. They forget that the CMDB needs love. And whereas in the previous model, the ITAM team are really focused on maintaining the accurate data in the tool, and if something goes wrong, they'll work out what's happened and get it fixed up. In this model, sadly, it's really common for the data in the tool to just be left alone. People are relying on it. Then they think, no, that's not quite accurate, but nobody fixes it up or is proactive about fixing it up. And you can gradually fall into a really vicious cycle of poor quality data. Nobody relies on it and nobody trusts it. Therefore, they don't rely on it. Therefore, there's no incentive to fix it up and make sure it's accurate for everybody else. So that's just something to watch out if you have this model deployed in your organization. There needs to be somebody, and not the ITAM team, who is accountable for working with all the data owners to make sure that the CMDB is accurate. So we have a quick poll. So if anybody has any questions about these three models, then please do put them in the Q&A box. But in the meantime, I've got a little poll here, just asking what sort of integration you have in your organization. So this is Slido, so you can either use your phone to use the QR code to go to the site and the poll, or you can go to slido.com in your browser and then type in the code 777015. So while we're doing that, do we have any questions? I know it's a bit early.
So a little bit of a question, I suppose, on your CMDB and this option 3, where things are fully automated, and you're referring to the, it could stagnate because everybody relies on the automated data, and that someone should intervene and liaise with people. I mean, how often would you be doing that with the various functions?
Sorry, what was that, Alan? I had to remove my cat.
So under CMDB option 3,
yeah,
you're talking about automation, and that people rely on the automation, and if you're not careful, things will stagnate and not be reliable. And you're referring to someone who should be talking to all the stakeholders in the CMDB and just verifying everything. I mean, how often should they be doing that sort of thing?
To be honest, in a large organization, it should be a job role, and really it should be the configuration manager role. But too many organizations don't. They'll build a business case for implementing a new service management tool, and they might put a service wrap around it so that, if the tool stops working, then they'll can log a call, and they know, where it's hosted and all the rest of it. But they often fail to recognize that actually for the configuration management data in that module to be accurate, you need to budget an additional role to do that.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So we've got the results coming in. So actually most of the people on the talk today have no integration at all. And one individual, I think, we've got 4 responses, I don't know, 25% are at the other extreme, where ITAM consumes the same data as IT service management. So that's really interesting, that actually the no integration model is still very, very common. So thank you. Now, if you just leave that browser open and also on your phone, we've got another poll later on. And when we get to that, you should be able to, it would automatically update. So do leave the browser on your phone or on your laptop or whatever open, because we will do another poll. Right, okay, moving on. Rory.
Thank you very much, Kylie. So thank you all still for bearing with us. We could have had some drop-offs by now, but I haven't been keeping an eye on the people dialing in and dialing out. I want to talk for a moment about entity relationship management and have some sort of a flashback to when I was at university, and it was one of the things that was banged into my head fairly early on, from the point of view that you would learn about entity relationship management to make sure that your databases were structured properly, because memory was at a premium. And it meant then that your queries were better managed and caused to use less memory if your entities were correctly established around the tables that sat in a database and the primary and secondary keys were acknowledged. That has kind of fallen away as we now sort of step into the modern age, and memory is just another expense that we throw into our cloud solutions. But all the same, if we are going to respect and manage those entities, we need to be able to recognize them and recognize too that they have a life cycle. So if we look at the trustworthy data in and around SAM, we could argue that our request is an entity, that our purchase or contract is an entity, that our software installation is an entity. And if we don't have the workflows that respect those life cycles for those entities working in harmony together, then we're going to create silos and silos of data that are just going to drive us into cul-de-sacs and really get in the way of offering the benefits that automation can arrive us at. So we've got an example following up shortly. We've taken a software contract. So like any entity, it has a basic life cycle of birth, amendment, and death, or retirement, or however you want to look at it. And if we start on the left-hand side, we've got how does a contract actually enter into the organization? It can come through the vendor onboarding activity. So making sure that we understand the terms and conditions within a contract, and also which software and which hardware, or what is a software contract, yeah, which software titles does that contract actually govern. Now, that is possibly a standalone physical document, or it is a PDF. We need to then get that into some sort of SAM solution, be it part of a service management suite or part of a dedicated SAM suite. So we would do that via the entitlement importation process. And invariably that is scanning documents, pulling out the T's and C's, putting them in an Excel spreadsheet in a format that the SAM suite can actually take forward. Over time, of course, we want to understand where we stand with a given vendor. An audit may be called. And so we have to retrieve that information and compare it against installation data and any other metrics then that may, may sort of drive the consumption of a license over and above basic installation. Finally, then at least on this screen, we've got a sort of contract review process. So not unlike the audit, we require that ELP. We want to know what we have installed. We want to know what we have in reserve. We might want to go to the wider business and understand what new titles do we want to put into that contract. And is it going to be a revised contract to the existing one? Or are we going to, I don't know, shut down the contract altogether? Perhaps it's a vendor that we don't want to deal with anymore. That's possibly an option too. But the consequences of following those actions through, say the termination of a contract, may kick off other processes like an uninstallation activity, because we no longer have the entitlement to justify the rights to use the software. We can hit the next one, Kylie. Thank you. So within these sort of primary steps of the life cycle, we've got various aspects that we want to make sure means that the data means something to the SAM suite and to the business also. So we've got data quality processes, things like making sure that when the data goes in, it looks like what we believe it should look like in the SAM suite, that we've captured all the data that we've sought to input. So we've got software asset data verification process is the one that immediately springs to mind. And then the SAM quality assurance process as well. So the physical act of importing that contract in, has that gone to plan? Have we got entitlements sat in a pending tray somewhere waiting to go in? Because it's not just the odd contracts, of course, it's the licenses that are bought under the umbrella of the contract. They need going in as well. So, and that's another thing to understand, is the attributes and entities of, or the attributes of that given entity also. There's relationships there that could kickstart yet more processes. All of these processes are open to potential automation. It's timely that we've arrived at the RPA slide. I think, Kylie, did you make reference to APIs when we're getting systems to talk to each other?
Just briefly, yes.
Yeah, so they are the highways, if you will, between systems. That's the way I like to sort of view it. For those who want to take the next step, rather than just doing straight data transfers between systems, and they actually want to manipulate the data once it's arrived at a given destination, robotic process automation is a great way forward. It takes a front end or end user view of data manipulation and mirrors and mimics then those activities that are systematic, laborious, and potentially could free up an employee to do something, shall we say, a bit more meaningful than the bog standard data entry, as a given example. So the idea typically is that you mirror those activities, make sure that they are it captures potentially every eventuality. I'm getting slightly ahead of myself here. We've got exception handling there as a sub-bullet, as one of the gotchas. A typical RPA consultant might, if they're not sort of got the wider view on, or they've got their blinkers on and just want to do the work and go, would be to model the vanilla version of a given process for automation. The better ones will tend to say, what happens if? And they'll look at those what if scenarios, those exception handling scenarios. So say, for example, you do import data into a SAM suite, and you find out that actually it's not been inserted correctly. There's been an error when we've actually transcribed it onto a spreadsheet and imported it. What do you do to expel that bad data out of the SAM suite, get it changed, and then get it re-imported again? If you are going to be setting up these bots to communicate between systems or on systems, you'll need access to the system. And there is a licensing aspect there to consider too as well, because some vendors like SAP, like Oracle, will potentially look at RPA as a user license. And so you'll need to watch out for that. But getting permission to that system in the first place is equally very important. And also accessing the data. So you could be given view-only rights to a given system, but actually you need read-write rights to make that RPA truly worthwhile. And the final point there on the slide is absolutely true. A bad process automated is still a bad process. Don't sort of take that USB approach that just merely by plugging APIs and RPAs over existing systems, as covered by Kylie in her previous slides, that somehow the magic is going to happen and you can all sit back. The RPAs, the bots will generate data in and of themselves as to performance, and they need managing.
So thank you, Rory. I'm going to pick up on that last point because I'm going to explain now what the impact is of automating a bad process. Now, when we do work, so we most of us sit at our desk Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and we do work. Broadly speaking, what we do can be put into two different buckets. One is the productive work. It's the work that's valuable. It's the work that we're paid to be doing. Now, a great example is, say, somebody in a call center who is maybe taking their work for an insurance company. So if they answer the phone and the call is somebody saying, I'd like to buy some insurance, then that's productive work. That's what they're there for. That's what the company's employing them to do. And that's brilliant. We love productive work. It's providing value to your company and it's providing value to the customer on the end of the phone who wants to buy insurance. However, bad processes generate a different type of work, which is called failure demand. And this is where the customer rings up and says, I'm trying to migrate from my old insurer to my new insurer and something has gone wrong. I need you to sort this problem out. And that is the type of work that nobody wants to be doing. Not only has it had an impact on the person who's picking up the phone and doing frustrating work because they know if the process worked better, they wouldn't have had this call, but the customer has had a load of additional work put on them because, of course, they don't want to be making the call. They just wanted the process to work. And then, of course, if fixing the problem up involves ringing somebody contacting the other insurance company that they're migrating from, then that's created additional failure work for the other insurance company as well. So what we need to make sure is that before we automate anything, but just in general, we need to do this anyway, we need to really think about the types of work that is being generated, and where it's productive work, fantastic, let's not worry about it. But where it's the failure demand, it's the work that's generated as a result of a failed process, we need to try and fix that up. And let me show you what happens if we put the effort in and if we improve our processes to get rid of failure demand. Nothing happens. Now, if you think about the insurance person who spends 50% of their time dealing with productive demand and 50% of their time dealing with failure demand, if we go away and improve that process, we've halved their workload. That's powerful. So this is one reason why I get really quite frustrated when people say, oh, I don't have time for process improvements, because actually the answer is you don't have time to not do the process improvements. If you focus on improving the process to get rid of the failure demand, believe me, you will have the time. So I hope that makes sense. because we're going to move on to something that's slightly different now, or completely different actually, and Rory's going to talk about tagging. But if you have any questions about failure demand, then please get back to me, or put something in the Q&A box.
Thanks, Kylie. Yeah, we threw tagging into this because obviously we've got this sort of transition or transformation that everybody is making towards the cloud now, and the idea that you can generate ELPs to the same tempo and beat as you could in the cloud as you can on-prem is not a good way, not a good future to take forward. And a possible antidote to that is implementing a taxonomy around software tagging and indeed hardware tagging as well. There's a lot of work going on in the ISO community around various instances of tag, and you see that we've got resource utilization measurement as well, so the tag that actually generates data around the consumption of software as well. The reason we've highlighted this for FinOps and for cloud is as much because if you want to be able to demonstrate or follow the principle of chargeback or showback, i.e. you can show a department what they're spending on IT, or if you want to charge back, you actually take the bill to that department and say, pay this, then tagging is a means by which you can actually sub-filter the massive data that is going to come from Azure, from AWS, from Google Cloud or Alibaba, if you go down that route. But the nice thing as well about these tags is that you can actually customize them. So if you have the wits about you to actually integrate tagging into your software request process, you can, as an example, put the request ticket in against the data. So there are organizations that are very sort of risk averse, and the technology has been in place for 10 years. We don't wish to switch it off because the sky could fall in. Well, let's go and ask the person who requested the technology in the first place. Who is it? Oh, I don't know. Well, the tag will tell you. And the beauty of it as well, of course, is that you can also put the IT service against which the IT asset was originally installed against. So all of a sudden, you're a SQL query away from generating ROI and TCO. And not just at the point of implementation when it's easiest to do because it's new, bright and shiny and it's in front of everybody, but rather through the life cycle of the service, if you make sure that you maintain tagging through your request process, be it hardware, be it software. One thing to highlight here is the consistency of tagging standards as well. It's a bit like the Wild West in that regard. People will say, oh, we created our own tags, we're devs, we know what we're doing. Perhaps there's a sort of a tagging nomenclature, that's the wrong word.
Taxonomy.
Taxonomy, that's easier to say, isn't it? Thank you, yeah. Provided by the cloud providers. Having a consistent approach to make sure that the data that comes back from the cloud provider can be sub-filtered and worked according to your benefits and reporting is absolutely vital. It's a bit like installing software in that regard. You don't just leave it to every Tom, Dick and Harry. You have a consistent approach.
But I think also consistency of using the same taxonomy across different asset classes is really key, because once we do that, then we can actually start saying, really applying ROI calculations to an entire service or TCO calculations to an entire service that isn't possible if we don't have a clear way of understanding who is using what and how they're using it, which is what tagging really can help maintain for us. And then we can use the tags to automate and run those reports much more easily. So I think it's really important, pretty much everybody's doing cloud tagging at the moment, but let's think about to what extent can we expand that out to actually start including the cost of the software and the hardware that also goes into making a service, so that we do genuinely have the holy grail of proper service-oriented TCO, which so many organizations are desperate for, but just struggle to provide.
Yeah. And equally to that point, as you start to roll out your tagging approach to support SAM and ITAM and your workflows, one thing that there is a flip side to this. There is almost an IT tipping point. This obviously is not a revolution. You're not going to sort of wake up one day and say, do you know what, we're going to tag the entire IT estate and here's a cast of thousands to make it happen. It's not going to happen. But what you could do is start with projects or programs, start with business critical services and start to actually put those tags in where necessary, and watch the evolution through the age of the IT estate roll forward. You will hit a tipping point, whatever that may be for your organization, whereby there will be a residue. There'll be an area of the IT estate or areas where tags haven't quite hit. And then you can look at the negative of the photo almost and say, right, why isn't it tagged? What value is it offering? Can we sort of, surgically dive in and start tagging those areas of the IT estate, or are they ripe for removal or wind down? And hopefully as well, it will start to drive out the notion that you can actually live with shadow IT. So from a licensing perspective, that's a complete no-no, but I do appreciate there are certain people in the service management world who have said, oh, it's self-service, it's fine. No, it's not. So anyway, that's me off my soapbox.
Move on, Rory, move on.
Yes, walk away from the light, yes. So the next thing to consider is that, say we've gone down that tagging route, that's great. We're looking to automate our workflows.
So Rory, just quickly.
Yes.
We've got a question. Do you mean physical tags or simply allocated references held within the ITAM tool or CMDB?
The latter. So these are XML tags. They sit next to the installation, or they sit on the hardware that they're supposed to represent.
And software and cloud instance.
That's what I said. I said
oh, okay.
Software. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, so measuring process performance. This is a joy. Obviously, we're going down the route of actually automating workflows wherever possible, because we don't want to be, say, we're going to look at we've got an example here of the software request process about to come up. We don't want to be relying on post-it notes, emails, nods and winks from project managers making stuff happen. We want it systematic, repeatable, and scalable as well. So if you are working for those large organizations, potentially your use cases and exception handling is going to be higher and wider. But if you want to scale accurate reporting, then you've got to go down the automated workflow route. You've got to consider those use cases and make sure that your software request workflow addresses all those eventualities. But an important point here is to think you might set a given KPI or a given value against the function of a given workflow. Don't go to DEFCON 5 if it trips above or below a certain limit. You're going to have a fudge factor there that you have to accommodate. That is part of life. Another important point too is that the SAM KPIs for the workflows or processes should support your IT and business goals. So if we've got an ethereal business goal of value for money, making sure we get the best use out of the capital that we put into the company, we've got a KPI that we're going to show you that hopefully will correlate to that in some way, shape or form at an operational level. When it comes to performance measurement, to try and make sure that you don't have people running around with clipboards and pens, it is not the way forward. You should be looking to gather the data from the workflow itself, and there are products and product sets out there that will do that for you. Things like Blue Prism, like UiPath, Commander, Automation Anywhere. They have an ecosystem within their workflow production systems that will actually capture metadata as you go through running the workflow. And as it says there on the screen there, when a KPI slips, it is a call to action. And we're going to run through an example shortly. And I'm going to touch on Alan's point about frequency of refresh around data as well between SAM and CMDB when we come to the next example. Because you could have a KPI against a given process, say the corporate governance process, how often do we generate an ITAM policy, for example? Well, your KPI is going to be potentially make sure it's done in the last 365 days. The frequency with which you revisit that doesn't mean to say that all of a sudden, it warrants looking at on a daily basis. So having that eye on data and data life cycles. What is the life cycle? A mayfly literally lives for a month, but humans, we live for sort of 80+ years. The life cycle will dictate how frequently you refresh and look at that data. Trend analysis is important too, and I'll come on to that in the example on the next slide here. Thanks, Kylie. So we've got a KPI against a software request process, and what we've done is we've said, from a service management point of view, you might argue that a good KPI would be time taken to complete the request, because we don't want people sitting around not being productive waiting for software to be installed, and it's a valid KPI. From a SAM point of view, though, we may wish to put a KPI against that process to say, we want to drill down on software in the license pool. So the cost or quantity of software honoured by the license pool from the request process in the last 30 days would be a good KPI to drive performance. Now, in this example, we've set an optimal value of £10,000 per month. So we're quite a large organisation. And as you can see, we might have implemented this process in January, and we're looking at this throughout the year, the performance. We might give some leeway for that January, February, and March to kick in, because the process is new. We're weeding out those people who are taking their corporate credit cards and going to Currys or PC World and buying their own software. No, Mr. Client, you can't do that. Here's the request portal. This is what you use. And then we seemingly have a spike in April. Now, this has tripped the upper and lower levels of acceptable behavior. So we might want to put our Sam Spade hat up and actually have a look at that. Why? Why is that? And it could be we've taken on a bunch of interns and they've raided the license pool, and good luck to them. That's great. We don't yet think, though, that there is a value in revising the limit that we've set for the process. Now, over the year, of course, what we tend to see is that if we're getting smarter with our software purchases, that we're only buying on demand as opposed to buying on supply, this figure is potentially going to go down and down. And you see that when we hit December, nothing has happened. Nobody is using software from the license pool. Now, again, that could be disastrous. It could be that people have found a workaround and are back buying their own software again. They've gone on the cloud. They're typing in their corporate credit card, and the software is just rolling out in an as-a-service fashion. So that's something that we need to have a look at. Equally, it could be, of course, that we've exhausted the license pool for all the software that is deemed valuable and attractive to people who are using the software request process as we've automated it. So that then would be a potential signal back to procurement that perhaps we need to either restock, if we did want to have that degree of fat in place, or we just revise the limit down. And that's a potential option too. So our target could shrink back and be reset then at that point. So trend analysis is quite important. You don't unleash the hounds on a monthly basis, but putting something like this in front of senior management as the year goes on, I think is really incredibly valuable to show that the automated process is working and driving value for the business. So I'll hand back or say what's the next KPI there, or the next slide.
So thanks, Rory. So here we have our second quiz. You should still have it open, hopefully, but if you don't, you can either use the QR code or go to slido.com and type in the access code. So do you manage ITAM with KPIs? So the first option is no, not at all. We fly by the seat of our pants. Not really, but we do lots of ELPs. The next question is yes, and we review our KPIs annually or quarterly to let us know when we're slipping off track. Or yes, we keep an eye on KPIs in real time. If there are problems, we're on to them. So let us know which of these four options is is how you work in your organization. Can everybody access that? Oh, yep, here we are. Great. So the majority of respondents don't use KPIs, and we do have one organisation that reviews annually or quarterly. So it would be interesting, you know, these polls, they always open up a load more questions that you want to ask, don't you, when you see the results? I'd really like to know why or what drives the annual or quarterly review rather than sort of trying to move to real time. Is that an aspiration, or is that something that you don't feel is necessary? The juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze. Be really interesting to know. So here we have another organisation that does lots of ELPs. So ELPs absolutely are their own form of KPI. But what they don't really do is they don't tell us when some of the life cycle processes start slipping, or allow us to really pinpoint where we might be going wrong in terms of compliance, actually within the processes that drive the life cycle of software as it moves through the organization. So, but yeah, perfect, lovely. Okay, well, let's move on then. I'm sort of conscious of time as well. If you do have any other questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll answer them as we go. So the next piece, the next slide is actually another concept that I really want to just get you thinking about. Really, you might have noticed this is a bit of a smorgasbord of ideas, this talk, which was the idea. So hopefully it's sparking stuff in your brains. So I'd like to introduce the concept of choice architecture, which is something that was popularized by the Nudge Unit and by a book they wrote. So the Nudge Unit in the UK government was thinking about ways of encouraging people to do things like take up health interventions and that sort of thing. So the best way to explain choice architecture is absolutely this photo. You can see it's a rubbish bin owned by Merton Borough Council here in London, in South London. And one side of the rubbish bin is for landfill, for waste that can't be recycled, and the other one is for waste that can be recycled. So in order to nudge people both to use the bin correctly and to make sure that they're putting their rubbish in the correct side of the bin, what they did was they put a photo of a rubbish truck dumping waste in a landfill on the landfill side, and then on the other side they've got some pictures of some nice clean bottles and cartons that can go in the recycling side, so that you know the sorts of things that can be put in that bin. So you can see how by just the way that Merton Borough Council has built the bin and then the images they've put on the side, they're nudging you to make a choice about how you dispose of your waste. And this concept is something that I think we really should be thinking about how we can bring into our own organizations, so that we build out our tools and our automation processes so that our preferred choice, which is the one that generally will be the correct one for the organization, is the one that it is easy for people to choose. We don't stop them from doing something else, because of course, just because we think something is right for our organization doesn't mean that in their specific circumstances that is the right choice. So we need to leave the options open, but what we do is we build our tools and build our automation workflows so that there is extra steps, for instance, that need to be taken to choose a non-standard piece of software. So some of the things that we could quite easily, well, relatively easily, implement in our own organizations may be to add the price information about a piece of software to the software request portal, so that people who are selecting software are steered towards the free or low cost version. We might have a set of standard cloud builds that people can just select from, but then have an other option that means that they can then go away and they can build out a cloud build that is right for their particular project if none of the standard options are available. If we get to the point where we have profiled our end users or profiled our departments, then we may even get to the point where we could only show specialist software to end users from specific departments. So for instance, we might only show options for engineering software to engineers, to people who have the job title of engineer, for instance. So these sorts of scenarios are all things that are ways in which we can nudge people to make decisions. But like I said, it is also really important to recognize that we do need to leave the door open to alternatives, but while still making the option we would prefer the easy option for people to take. So I hope that makes sense, because it's the picture explains it well. It's harder to put into words. Excellent. So moving on then, if we've got no more questions, we're going to talk about use cases, which is something that Rory has mentioned a little bit. So a use case is how data flows between systems and people. And they encompass more than one process. And one of the great things about looking in detail at your different use cases is that they ensure data doesn't disappear into black holes. So I was watching some videos on use cases the other day, and I came across a great one which said, think of a use case as a ping pong. So the user does something that then triggers the system to do something, and then that triggers an end user to do something else, and then that triggers the system, that triggers the user to do something, and then we end up with sort of the processes at the end and the value being realized. So when we're implementing automation, it can be very powerful to sit down and think through what our use cases are. Because it may be that once we do that, we identify user steps that we can automate and turn into system steps. Or we might identify that in order to successfully complete the use case, we need to use two different systems, and we've got no connectivity between the two systems. And so we're ending up inputting a manual process that we could potentially automate, for instance. So, or double entry, where we could just use an API and have the data automatically transferred from one system to another. So use cases are really useful from that perspective, to really get down into the detail of where our data is flowing to help us both automate and to automate well. So we have a question. So I'm just going to, oh no, actually it was just Marilyn saying we've got 5 minutes. It's okay, we're nearly at the end. So use cases are great because they're very detailed. But one of the problems with use cases, and indeed, ill thought through automation, is that we can automate perfectly, but still not actually provide value to the people who are the point of doing the processes and the exercise. So another way of thinking about this is to take a big step back. So whereas use cases are really detailed, value streams are a big step back, and they identify the value provided to the customer at the end of the set of processes, and then think about what the steps are that we needed to do in order to provide that value. So I'll explain this, and again, we'll use the software request and deployment process as an example. So the value is a person sitting at their computer using a piece of software. So it's being deployed to them, they log in or they access the software and they start working. That is the point where the value is realized. But in order to get to that point, we've got a request process. We've got a deployment process, and if we don't own the license, then we need to go out and buy it. So we have a procurement process. So the value stream will be looking at all of the steps in all of those processes to get us to the point where the end user is using the software. The other important thing about value streams is they're very focused on time, because actually we reduce the value and cause frustration if processes take longer than they really need to. So an example here is one of our process maps. It's the first page of the software request process, and we've appended an understanding of what the lead time is, which is effectively the waiting time between one step and the next step, and the performance time. So in this example, we can see it took 10 minutes for an individual to raise a request. But if it was a software title that had been pre-approved, it took 5 seconds for the supported software catalog to check itself and make sure that yes, we can deploy that software. And then it took 20 minutes for the automation that deploys the software to kick off and deploy the software, and then 20 minutes later, the individual is able to start using their software. Now, compare that with a non-pre-approved piece of software that does require management authorization. Now, that request may, this very slow organization, sit in the service desk for 3 days before somebody can analyze it to determine whether or not, whether it's acceptable and what authorization path is required. And then it may take another 2 days for the request to actually be approved, perhaps because it got lost in somebody's email, or there was a number of different approvers who were all being emailed in a daisy chain. So the value stream allows us to look at this, or the value stream map allows us to look at this scenario and think, right, can we cut that lead time down? What could we do to reduce the lead time from 3 days to 5 seconds? Maybe, or to whatever. And then it can also look at the request approval process and say, right, can we reduce that from 2 days down to something similar, something much faster? And this is where our choice architecture comes in, because of course, maybe an email that gets lost in an email inbox is not the best way of sending that email. Maybe there's an alternative way which flags up the need for an approval more clearly so people don't forget about it. So there's all these sorts of things to think about and to implement, and that can be brought up by doing a proper value stream mapping methodology like this. So we've got some more questions. Oh no, people are dropping off. Oh well, it's a bit sad. I'm going to finish because we've got just one more slide. So this is a different concept again, which is something to think about when you are determining the success or failure of an intervention or a change that you've made. And this is success and failure bias. So in our world, and when we make a change, sometimes we see an impact or sometimes we don't. Now, if we see the impact of the change very clearly, then we could say that that intervention has a success bias. So IVF, for instance, has a success bias because our friends and our family rejoice in the miracle babies that are wandering around. But what you don't see is you don't see the families where IVF has failed because they don't have any children to stimulate the conversation about whether, that this was an IVF baby or not, or whether they'd gone through IVF. And I was talking with a friend and she said it's the same with breastfeeding. She struggled with breastfeeding and it was really challenging for her because she would go online and she'd see all these joyous stories about how wonderful breastfeeding was and think everybody else was doing it except for her and she was a complete failure. And of course she's not. It's just that breastfeeding, like IVF and like many other things, has a success bias when we trust our gut feelings. Now, intranet information pages are the opposite. They have a failure bias. So the thing with an intranet information page is we put the work in, we put it up there, and we never see the people that read it and then think, great, I know how to do that, and then go away and do it. We only see or hear from the people who either didn't read it, couldn't be bothered reading it, didn't understand it, etc. So this is why you often see on the bottom of help pages a little note saying, was this document helpful? And this example here is actually from the HP website. We bought a printer recently and I needed to work out how to set it up. So they've found an alternative way of bypassing or getting around the failure bias inherent in information pages by putting this little notice up. And if I click yes, then they know that the page helped me. And they're not allowing themselves to be prone to the inherent failure bias. So I think the message here is very much that we need to be creative about how we measure the success of our interventions, of our process improvements, and the changes that we make, so that when we do automate, we're automating good processes that work well and which are really effective. So thanks so much for listening, and apologies we went over slightly. So are there any final questions or comments? It doesn't look like it. So thank you very much.